Alfred the Great had an abundance of qualities that stood him in good stead in the face of the fearful threat posed by the Vikings. Firstly, Alfred had a seemingly endless supply of resilience. In 878, Alfred's kingdom of Wessex was having to withstand Viking incursions led by Guthrum, who was already king of East Anglia and now had his eyes set on further conquest. Alfred soon found himself deep in trouble and on the run, and he could be found trudging through swamps and woodland in the southwest, trying to avoid capture. If Alfred was indeed captured, he may well have gone the same way as another Anglo Saxon king, Edmund of East Anglia, who had been brutally martyred by the Vikings less than a decade earlier. It was during this ignominious retreat that Alfred had to employ all the resilience at his disposal. Since about 868, around the time of his wedding, Alfred had been suffering from Crohn's disease, which brought him terrible and recurring pain that could be debilitating. Alfred, however, could not let illness get the better of him. His kingdom and people needed him. Summoning up all his courage, Alfred roused himself once more and his men and routed the Vikings at the Battle of Edington against almost impossible odds. This battle was a crucial victory for not only the future of Wessex, but also for the future of a potentially unified England. The second quality I'd like to attribute Alfred with was that he was a quick learner. During the reign of his brother Athelred I, Alfred, still only a young man, joined in Athelred's battles against the Vikings. Alfred witnessed firsthand how difficult a job it was to be a king under threat from these Scandinavian raiders, and Athelred suffered defeat far more than he enjoyed success. However, Alfred would have gained valuable insight into how the Vikings fought so ferociously. By the time the Battle of Edington was fought, Alfred would have recalled all the desperate moments he had shared with Athelred, and no doubt determined that it wouldn't happen again. Defeat at Edington may have spelled the end for Alfred, and so defeat was not an option. Everything he had learned in the past would now have to be put firmly into practice. Thirdly, Alfred was a man with tremendous and an almost unique foresight. For him, it wasn't only about the present, but the future also. Alfred knew, despite victory at Edington and other gains, that the future of Wessex was still incredibly fragile, and he needed to plan accordingly for the next generation. He prepared his children for adulthood by providing them with the best education he could, and indeed, he'd encouraged this for all children in his kingdom. Most notable of his children were Edward the Elder, who would succeed Alfred as king, and a daughter named Athelfled, who would marry a Mercian nobleman. Trained in the martial arts of a young warrior, Edward would, as a teenager, join Alfred on campaigns. On one occasion, young Edward, leading one half of the royal army, forced a Viking army into retreat, and, somewhat rashly, went charging after it. Edward, given his youth, can be forgiven for this hot headedness. What was clear was that Alfred had reared a courageous heir to his crown, and that courage could be seen equally as clearly in Athelfled. On the death of her husband in 911, Athelfled became sole ruler of the Mercians, and with a combination of guile, force, and diplomacy, she captured significant territories from the Vikings. Alfred, who had died in 899, would have been immensely proud of his daughter and her resourcefulness. Before Alfred's death, he had presented his grandson and Edward's son, Athelstan, with a beautiful sword and belt, stating that in this young boy a great king would one day emerge, and Athelstan would grow to be exactly that, and this was no coincidence. Alfred had cultivated in his own children a tremendous spirit and bravery. Athelfled, after a difficult birth, for example, to her one and only child, refused point blank from then on to give her husband any more children, which her husband, another Athelred, accepted without question. For a woman to be so assertive in the Middle Ages was testament both to Athelflaed's strong womanhood and the rearing she had received from Alfred. Alfred was also a man who placed others before himself. As touched upon earlier, to him the duty of kingship and the protection of his subjects was of far greater importance than his own troubles with illness. When his loyalty was not reciprocated, Alfred would not be best pleased. For example, whilst in effective exile in 878, Alfred discovered that some of his subjects had surrendered to Guthrum. Alfred was highly disgruntled by this, as he struggled to survive on what food he could find. As a result, Alfred plundered food and supplies from not only the Vikings to ensure he and his men survived, but he also targeted the land of those Englishmen who had chosen to wave the white flag rather than fight. Alfred thinking of others can also be found in his published works. Alfred was a huge believer in knowledge and learning, and he translated books into Old English so a wider audience in his kingdom could have access to them. On his motives for doing this, Alfred wrote, "In short, I wanted to live honourably as long as I lived, and leave behind, for the people who would come after me, the memory of me in good works." Alfred was tireless in his efforts to provide his people with the best possible kingdom he could build. From staving off Viking raids to educating the rich and poor, great and humble alike, Alfred remains one of the most dutiful kings in English history. Touching one final time on his military accomplishments and once more upon Alfred's ingenuity, we must state that on more than one occasion Alfred defeated the Vikings at their own game, i.e., at sea, by producing his own type of navy. Whatever the obstacle that confronted Alfred, whether it be illness, war, or some other matter of life and death, he overcame it, and in the shape of the new generation that would follow, led by Edward and Athelflaed, Alfred had ensured Wessex would not only survive, but expand.